Parmesan cheese, blue cheese, truffles, and the HiFiMan Audivina, for me, all belong in kind of the same sentence because there's something a bit funky about the HiFiMan Audivina, something a little bit wrong, and yet that's also what makes them enjoyable to me. These are a really unique closed-back planar magnetic headphone from HiFiMan, and I know that some people really dislike them, and I completely get it, but I think there'll be others of you that really love them, and I certainly can see why. They're very unique, they're very different. Let me explain to you why. Coming in at $1,999 the HiFiMan Audivina isn't a cheap closed-back headphone. It's got quite a premium look, quite a premium feel, at least in HiFiMan terms, which is to say that the build quality on HiFiMan, even at the top tier, is still a step behind other great headphone brands. But at $2,000 they are a premium headphone. They're probably, I think, the second from the top in the HiFiMan range, behind the HER10 if I've got the model number correct off the top of my head. And what you're getting for your $2,000, as I said in the intro, is a closed-back planar magnetic headphone. The Audivinas come in with an impedance of 20 ohms and a sensitivity of 97 decibels, so they're a pretty easy headphone to drive in terms of power. And then in terms of quality, I'll explain a bit more about what sort of quality you might want for these and what sort of tonality is going to suit them best. Because they are very unique, as I've already said, and I will explain why shortly. Before we get to that though, let's talk about some of the other design features going on in the Audivina. And that's to say that they're using the stealth magnet technology that I think is now in almost every single HiFiMan model. They're also using the super nano diaphragm, which means it's a very lightweight diaphragm and therefore theoretically very responsive diaphragm being used. The diaphragm being the sheet of material that actually makes the sound waves. And then wrapping all that up, because these are a closed-back headphone, are real wooden cups. And these cups apparently have been inspired by one of the great theatres in Germany, I think it was. I haven't written the name in my notes, but it's on the HiFiMan website. The key takeaway and what I have got in my notes is the fact that these have been inspired and therefore designed to replicate the acoustics of an old-style theatre. And that means a theatre where the acoustics were specifically designed for live music performances to enable that music to fill the space properly and effectively. And so what HiFiMan have apparently done is taken inspiration of that concept and used it to make these cups. Now when I pull these apart, I have to say they just look like wooden cups on the inside. But having said that, I don't know if the specific measurements and dimensions of the cups have been very carefully considered to break down any reflections, any issues that you might have within the back of the headphone. What I can tell you is that either the tuning, the cups, or a combination of both has created a really fantastic sounding headphone in terms of the space that they produce. I'll talk a lot more about sound quality soon, but the amount of space in the soundstage and separation in the soundstage that the Audivinas produce is nothing short of remarkable for closed back. It's right up there with some of the other best that I've heard, such as the DCA Stealth. One final thing to talk about when we're talking about features and design and the intent from HiFiMan is that the Audivinas, according to all the marketing, have really been focused, it seems, on classical music and particularly things like string quartets. I've seen quotes from Dr. Fang Bian, who's the head of HiFiMan, talking about the fact that these have really been designed with studio use in mind. So apparently engineers were asking for a headphone like this, and then the marketing suggests that they're focused on things like string quartets. So I'm wondering if they've got a very focused purpose on producing a sound that is good for people that are doing mixing and mastering of such string quartet type recordings. But whatever the reason, that seems to be their emphasis, is acoustic, classical type music. As I said, I'll talk a lot more about how these actually sound shortly, but before we do get there, I just want to quickly cover off the rest of the information about the build, design, the features, the bits they come with, all that sort of stuff. And we might start off with the actual design of the headphone itself and the build of the headphone itself. Now you can see most of it here already in my hands. I've talked about the wooden cups. I think they're quite nice. I'm not normally a fan of this very orangey sort of timber, but it is very nicely done in the case of the Audivinas. We've then got these metal strips around the outside of the cups to connect to the yokes, and this uses what I'd call the premium HiFiMan headband. So this is what you find on something like an HE1000 SE, an HE1000 Stealth, or a Susvara. And that's to say that it's got the rotating swiveling style yokes. It's also then got the perforated headband up here. And that means that theoretically we're getting the very best that HiFiMan has to offer in terms of headband comfort and design. And that then couples up to the way the ear pads attach to the head. I say attached, they obviously don't attach to the head, but the way they sit on the head. And the good news is that we've also got a really nice quality set of pads here. There's nothing different to what we're used to from other headphones other than the colour. And that's to say that there's a fabric facing piece that touches the skin, and then a leather or a fake leather around the outside, and a perforated leather or fake leather on the inside. And I do believe it is a fake leather, they call it leatherette. Something else that's a bit unique and different and that I really, really like is that the pads then connect to the cups with a sort of Velcro type system. It's not technically Velcro, and therefore I think it's going to last much better. It's not going to attract the fluff and the issues that Velcro does over time. But underneath the headphone pads, it's this very simple fabric connection system. And so gone are the days of having those little plastic tabs that you have to kind of click into place just the right way. They are still using that on recent models like the Aria Organic and the Ananda Nano. But in the case of the Audivina, they've gone with sort of pseudo-Velcro approach, and I think it's fantastic. While I've got the pads off, you'll also see that it's a very interesting internal design around the driver. Rather than having the full face of the driver exposed, as it would be in some of the open models, Aria, Ananda, the Susvara, etc., instead what we've got here is this interesting set of cutouts. There's some padding around the outside, this oval-shaped padding, and then further on the inside, there's actually like a star cutout system that's allowing only some of the driver to be exposed to the ears. Now, I'm not sure why that is. It's not talked about in the marketing that I've seen anywhere, but it was one of the first things I noticed when I had a look inside these. Beyond the attachment of the pads and the general design of the headphones, and that's the other thing I like about these is that's on that simply. It's a very simple system to put on and remove pads. The other thing to talk about is that we've got 3.5mm sockets down the bottom of the headphones, and so that means that anyone that's got existing HiFiMan cables, as in existing aftermarket HiFiMan cables, can use those with these. But then the other thing that's worth noting is that the Audivinas actually come with 3 cables. They're nothing special in terms of cables, but you do get 3 options. They're the newer style HiFiMan cables, which are a rubberized cable, far better than some of the older ones in terms of the ergonomics, but still not special, as I said. What's nice though is you're getting a 3.5mm, a 6.3mm, and a 4-pin XLR cable. So you've got lots of versatility with the Audivinas, assuming you're going to want to listen to them, and that's what we're going to get to now. Before I jump into the sound quality, I did just notice in my notes, I forgot to touch on the comfort of these. I mentioned that the headband's kind of the premium HiFiMan headband, but these are also quite a heavy headphone. Despite that very hollow design of the ear cups, these still weigh in at 470 grams. And that's not huge in the scheme of things. We're not talking on the levels of some of the Audisies or even some of the ZMF headphones. But I have found that these occasionally start to feel a bit heavy on my head. Even though it is using an excellent suspension headband system, I think the type of leather being used up there and the lack of any sort of padding does eventually cause some problems with weight. Those of you with hair will probably be less affected by this than someone like me who's got a bald head. So that is going to be one of those personal things whether you find these comfortable or not. And I would say that generally speaking, they're very comfortable, but the weight does start to get to me after a while, and it might also be to do with the way they clamp, the clamp force, etc. So keep that in mind. I personally find I can wear things like the HE1000 SE or the Aria Organic for longer sessions than I can with the Audivinas. And so now that I've covered that off and not forgotten it, let's get into sound quality. As I said at the beginning, these are a very funky sounding headphone. And sometimes for me, a funky sounding headphone immediately means it's bad. But in this case, it kind of means it's different and interesting, and I'll try and explain why and try to help you understand if it's a tuning that you might enjoy. Most of my specific listening notes for this have been written direct from the Chord Hugo TT2, but I've listened to these on tube amps, solid-state amps, high-end amps, low-end amps, you name it. I've given these a good go across a bunch of different things. And what I'm going to tell you is fairly consistent across the board, but do keep in mind that different amps with different characters, different source chains with different characters will influence this a little bit. One of the first things you notice about the Audivinas when you put them on, and in terms of sound at least, is just how crisp the treble is. But not in a harsh way. It's actually very refined, but they are quite crisp. And to my ears at least, that comes down to a bit of emphasis in the upper end of the treble. It doesn't make them bad in the treble, but it is not entirely natural and yet also quite interesting. Moving down to the mid-range, and that bit of treble emphasis does kind of bleed down into the mid-range and make them quite mid-range forward, or upper mid-range forward I should say. And so what that means is that on things like female vocals they sound quite nice, but on male vocals it can miss a little bit of the body and weight behind the vocal. You get a lovely sense of texture and clarity, breath and air, but you do lack a little bit of that body and that chest resonance that you will want from deeper vocals. That also means that some instruments can have a slightly kind of disembodied sound, and whilst it's only relatively slight, it's not a really sort of honky mid-range sound, but it is enough that it does throw off naturality. And as I'll talk about in a little while, it does also mean that if you're coming from a different headphone over to these, it can be a little bit of a shock to your ears initially. As we come down into the bass, they've actually got a really nice sense of punch. They've got a really nice tight bass that does thump quite well, so long as you're looking for that mid-bass sort of sound. They roll off relatively sharply at about 50 Hz, so you will find that for really deep sub-bass content, they're a little tiny bit lacking. But much like the recently reviewed ETA-02 headphones, it's tuned in such a way that you don't tend to notice it. So unless you've got a lot of content, a lot of music you're listening to that has really deep bass and not much mid-bass, you're not so much going to hear that there's a bit of roll-off in the sub-bass here. And the bass that is there, as I've already said, is tight and punchy and with a good sense of weight to it. And so overall, I find the tonality of these to be a bit wonky, a little bit funky, but just like things like Parmesan cheese, blue cheese and truffles, as I said at the beginning, they're somehow enjoyable almost because of their funkiness. They have this wonderful sense of delicateness and articulation to their sound. There's a few gaps in the sound, but it almost helps to improve things in terms of separation, articulation, clarity. And that's really how I'd sum up the sound of these from a tonal point of view, is they've got a wonderful sense of clarity and delicateness in their sound from a tonal point of view, without ever getting into harshness. They're not playing on excess treble as a way of getting it to sound detailed and clear. And whilst I said before that there is a bit of treble emphasis, and there is, it's not skimming the entire headphone into treble. There's enough bass behind it to give them a little bit of balance, albeit a funky kind of balance. And if none of this is making sense to you yet, I will give you a comparison in just a few moments to the ZMF Atrium Closed. But before we get there, I want to talk about the technicalities of the Audivina. First and foremost, things like detail and resolution are very good for these. Particularly as a closed back, they're very, very resolving and detailed because of that sound, that tonality I spoke about before. Their soundstage, as I've already alluded to, is immense for an open back headphone. They're right up there and possibly even bigger than something like a DCA Stealth. I haven't compared them, so I can't say for sure. But they produce a really big soundstage, both in width and quite a good sense of depth too. Within that soundstage, there's also excellent separation, no sense of congestion. You can clearly hear the space between each sound. And probably the only area that I'd knock them a little bit is that I feel like they don't focus the image as well as I'd hope. And I only mean that in the context of everything else they're doing. So everything else they're doing in terms of separation and soundstage is nothing short of exceptional for a closed back in my opinion. But the focus of the image isn't quite as sharp as I'd like. And I think that comes down to the lack of weight in some of the sounds. Part of getting a clear definition of where a sound is in space, how big it is in space, all those sorts of things, come down to the sense of presence, the sense of weight that it has. And because these do have that quite delicate sound, you do lose a little bit of that sense of body, three-dimensionality and weight in different sounds, and that does get in the way of a really clean and sharply focused image. They're not bad when it comes to the imaging, they're just not quite as strong as other things like soundstage size and instrument separation. And so for me, it's the technicalities of these that actually set them apart. I think if they didn't have the soundstage size and separation, and they still had this wonky tonality, I think I'd probably be giving these a negative review. But as it is, it's those technicalities that kind of actually take me more into enjoying these because they're so unique in what they deliver. And it's one of those things, you probably can't properly appreciate this until you hear them. It's very hard for me to describe the physical presentation of these. I can describe the tonal presentation easily, but it's very hard to explain the physical presentation of these without hearing them. Of course, I'll continue to do my best in just a moment with a comparison, but they're one of those headphones where I'd say make sure you try them out for yourself if you can, before deciding to buy a pair or deciding to just write them off and ignore them, because there will be negative reviews about them. They're very unique, they're very different, but I think they can be quite enjoyable. Before I move on to the comparison with the Atrium Closed, I do want to cover off some genre-specific stuff about the Audivinas. As I said in the opening, these seem to be targeted fairly heavily towards classical listeners, and so I did some listening with various classical music, and what I found was that they're certainly at their best with classical, I think, and other acoustic genres too. Having that sense of space, separation, that kind of delicate and articulate sound really brings to life acoustic music when listening through these, at least in my opinion. And as I listen to each individual instrument in, say, a string quartet, somehow, and it's probably the tuning of these, they kind of get each individual instrument mostly right. I think where they come undone is when you've got a full range recording where you've got all different instruments covering all different frequency ranges, whereas somehow they seem to work a little bit better when you've got a violin, a viola, a cello, that each operates kind of within its own range. Having said that, I do feel like the lower registers of violins, and therefore kind of the whole register of a viola, those can sound a little bit off to me from the Audivinas. But it's not something that I noticed happening too often. It's only some tracks where I really heard it. What that does mean though is that if you do get a full orchestral piece, the orchestra can sound a little bit honky sometimes. The way the mid-range is emphasised at the upper end of the mid-range and then it's a bit lacking in the lower end of the mid-range, that can cause a few problems, again depending on the recording, but it's just enough that they're not entirely natural and they are a little bit funky, as I've said a few times already. If we move over to genres like rock, pop, blues, etc., it's kind of a mixed bag. I find that it depends a lot on the recording, just how much I like them or don't like them. I don't think I ever hate them though. They're not a headphone where I've ever listened to something and gone, oh, this is dreadful, get it off. The worst end of the scale for me is, this is kind of interesting and different. It's never something where I've not enjoyed it. And at the same time, when you do get a track that works well with them, they're really quite unique. Not natural by any stretch, not, I think, true to the recording by any stretch, but enjoyable at least to my ears. And this brings us round to the area that I've actually found them to be surprisingly excellent, and that's for gaming. These, for me at least, have been one of my favourite go-to headphones for playing games. In this case, I've been playing a lot of Baldur's Gate 3 lately, and they're wonderful for that. Because of their sense of space that they produce, the ambient sounds within games like Baldur's Gate 3, any games where you want to hear the environment around you, and I'm guessing it might work for first-person shooters too, I haven't tested it, but they're really excellent for that because they let you focus in on details, they separate sounds beautifully, and there's lots and lots of space to work with. So for me, they're actually one of my favourite gaming headphones of any sort, but specifically as well as a closed-back headphone for gaming. So keep that one in mind if you want to have a closed-back headphone that's interesting for music and really fun for gaming, these could be just the one. But before we close things off there, I do think it's really important with a funky headphone like this to put them into some context. And so I grabbed myself the ZMF Atrium Closed because it's another closed-back. It retails for a little bit more than the Audivina. It also happens to be one of the few closed-backs I have in my possession at the moment that are around about the same price, albeit $500 US more, but I thought these would be a really good comparison point. Before I go through the comparison though, I do just quickly want to mention I've had for quite some time now a database down in the description below, a link through a database where I recommend the different products that I think are worth your consideration. Because I felt like it was maybe a little bit complicated or a little bit clumsy for some people to access that database. I've recently made some changes, and so now what you'll find, if you look in the description down below, is a whole lot of different links. What I've essentially done is produced a separate mini database for each category of product. There's one for headphones, one for DACs, one for amps, you name it. So if you're wanting to know what I recommend at each price point within each category, you can use those links down below. It shows you the pricing of each product so you can look within your price range. And then there's links to the reviews of the products and also purchasing links too. So check those out. I hope they're helpful. But for now, let's talk about the ZMF Atrium Closed up against the Audivina. For this test, I decided to run the TT2 as my DAC, but feed it into the Linear Tube Audio MZ3. And I did that for two reasons, or kind of only one reason, which is that both of these headphones are going to benefit from that sort of setup. ZMF headphones almost always sound their best from tube amps. I believe Zach does a lot of his tuning on tube amps, and therefore I do find the treble from these, and I mean these as in almost all ZMF headphones, the treble on them almost always benefits from just being smoothed over a little bit by the tube amps. And then if we're talking about the Audivinas, because they've got that slight lack of weight and body through the mid-range, I do find that for those, they're going to benefit from more kind of warm or richer sounding setups. So you can either go with a tube amp that's got a bit of extra mid-range weight, and admittedly the MZ3 isn't a particularly weighty or kind of tubey sounding tube amp, but it's got that slightly smoother treble to help offset any kind of hollowness in the mids. And then while we're talking about it, the other thing that could work really well with the Audivina is using it with, say, an R2R DAC, maybe in NOS mode, something like the recently reviewed EF600 from HiFiMan. That's going to be a good fit too. And so that's why I used the MZ3 for this comparison, was I was trying to give both headphones their chance to sound their very best. I listened to a few different tracks through this combination, and I took notes on two in particular. The first one was Bar Rumba by Mo Horizons, and starting off with the Audivinas, they sounded great on this track. There's an upright bass at the beginning that comes across with really good tonality and a nice sense of attack each time the strings are plucked. This is again from the Audivina. Then there's also hand claps and possibly some other sounds. There's lots of samples used here, but they've got a great sense of clarity, so all the percussive sounds have a great sense of clarity and separation in the mix from the Audivina. And that's probably what stands out to me most as I listen to the Audivina, is just the way they spread the sound out around you, not in an incoherent way, but in a well-separated way. I think as I reflect on it, they're probably only a step or two away from becoming incoherent, but they haven't quite gotten there, which is a good thing. They're maintaining a sense of coherency whilst giving you excellent separation of all the sounds. Moving over then to the Atrium Closed, and it's a noticeably thicker, richer sound. Not saying it's better or worse, just noticeably thicker and richer. It does mean that the Atrium Closed sounds slower in comparison to the very nimble sound you get from the Audivinas. And this is probably a good point of differentiation here. The Audivinas are not bright, but they're nimble. They've got a leaner sound, but not a really bright sound. And what that means is they've got this lovely sense, as I've already said, of that sort of delicateness and this nimbleness that I've just mentioned. That does come at the cost of some weight and body in the sound, but it's kind of a trade-off I'm happy to make with these. Continuing the comparison with the Atrium Closed, and what I noticed as well with the Atrium Closed, as well as the thickness of the sound that they have comparatively to the Audivina, is that they've also got a smaller feeling soundstage. The left-right width of them is a little bit narrower, not a huge amount, but I think you're losing significant depth compared to the Audivina. Having said that, not everything goes the way of the Audivina, because the mid-range and the general tonality of the Atrium Closed, to my ears at least, is much more natural. The Atrium Closed also have a better sense of bass, weight, and depth and extension. And on a track like Bar Rumba, I think the Atrium Closed sounds far better than the Audivina. None of this is to say the Audivina sounds bad, but if I was listening to this track or other music like it, it would be the Atrium Closed I'd want to listen to, not the Audivina so much, if I had the choice. The good news is, though, that if I only had the Audivina, I would still enjoy it through them. It sounds different, it sounds unique, but still enjoyable. Moving over then to some classical music and listening to Souvenir de Florence by the Trondheim Soloists. And starting off this time with the Atrium Closed, the sound from these again is lovely and rich. It's still got plenty of detail and character to it, but it's very smooth, very easy to listen to in a really good way. I'd say the separation of sounds from the Atrium Closed on this track isn't amazing, but it's certainly not bad, and it's perfectly enjoyable on a track like this. I think more so what was happening here was that I knew what was coming in the case of the Audivina. I knew the sort of separation I could expect from those, and so the Atrium Closed won't do that. Having said that, it still sounded very true to life for listening to a small string ensemble in a nice space. Then as I moved over to the Audivina, it initially sounded quite wrong. Tonally, it just sounded a bit wonky, as you'd expect from what I've already said. However, they're close enough to not being that wonky that my brain adjusted within seconds. It wasn't one of those cases where I had to put them on and let them play for a couple of minutes. It was literally within a few bars of the music, I was back to hearing them sounding quite okay. They did still sound unique and different, but not in a way that had me distracted and thinking they felt completely wonky. Once my brain did adjust, all of a sudden the Audivinas again become extremely enjoyable, wonderfully detailed, and just generally a fun listen on a track like this one. They definitely lack the body and the weight and the presence of other headphones, but it makes them interesting and different. And that's probably a good summary of how I hear the Audivinas overall. I don't see the Audivina as a one and only headphone for people. Unless you happen to love it, that's great. If you happen to love it and it's your one and only headphone, that's great. But for me, I'm not going to sit here and recommend them as your one and only headphone. I think they're a headphone that's very enjoyable, they're very unique, and I like that about them. But they're also a headphone that occasionally is going to sound a bit wonky on some tracks. And they're a headphone that for me is quite complementary to other headphones. They're a headphone that I'd want to own alongside others. And it's a bit like, as I said before, Parmesan cheese, blue cheese, or truffles. You don't necessarily want to eat that every single meal. But every now and again to get that burst of something different, something fresh, something vibrant, and I mean that from a kind of full experience point of view, that's where I think the Audivinas come in. reaching for these and putting them on is almost like a palate cleanser at times. It gives you a totally different approach to the music that's in itself very enjoyable. And then it also means that when you come back to your other headphones, those suddenly remind you of what's so good about them as well. And I'm conscious as I say this that it sounds like I'm telling you to spend $2,000 on a palate cleanser headphone that you put on just to reset yourself. And that's not what I mean. They're enjoyable in their own right. They're a headphone that I have and will continue to put on and have an extended listen to from time to time. But they're never going to become a daily driver for me, and I'm not thinking and sitting here recommending them as a daily driver for people, unless you happen to really like their presentation and maybe if they happen to suit the music you listen to. But more for me, how I see these is, if you had a pair of HE1000 SEs or Aria Organics or whatever the other headphone might be, doesn't have to be HiFiMan of course. If you had another pair of headphones, maybe it's your open backs, and you want something different and you want something closed, I think the Audivina are worth a look at. And so, as I said before, I can't really properly explain to you the physical representation of the music that these provide. What I will do is take a quick recording of some music through these, like I did for the Diana version 2 review a little while ago. I might actually play the two headphones that I've just talked about today, that being the Atrium Closed and the Audivina, just to try to give you some sense. I'm never a huge fan of recorded sound demos because they're then going to be influenced by your source chain, your DAC, your amp, your headphones. But I think because these are so hard to describe effectively, I do want to do that, and we'll just see how it goes. So if you've watched to this point, firstly, thanks, and secondly, check out, I'll put a link down below, and then also you'll probably have come up in your YouTube recommendation feed. Do check out my sound demo of the Audivinas and the Atrium Closed, and hopefully I can share with you there just what I'm talking about and just what the differences are. For now though, as always, I hope you found the video useful, helpful, and interesting. And if you have, please hit the like button, and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the recommendation links down below and let me know in the comments if they're more helpful for you now. But then beyond that, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.